you've always been a poet who's not only concerned with formal artistry and disciplined poetics, but also with the commitment that poetry is a public conversation that serves the common good. You write in your introduction of the Five Quintets that poets have a part to play in shaping our public discourse. I think of, poets everywhere of all time, but I think of American poets here, people from Walt Whitman to Langston Hughes to Gwendolyn Brooks or Robinson Jeffers. I think of Leslie Marmon Silko and Adrienne Rich. I think of one of my favorite poets, Denise Levertov, who was very public about her politics, and maybe we can come back to that later. There's a long Irish tradition as well of this type of engagement. And I just reviewed a book by your fellow countryman, John F. Dean, and he has a poem called The Widow. And Dean is lamenting an Ireland that seems to have sold its soul to a greedy figure dressed in, quote, a pink tie and golfer's cufflinks, who tells, quote, gorgeous lies, an Ireland that melted down with the rest of us in the 2008 financial crisis. The speaker in that poem confronts this figure, asking him, quote, that on your watch, the people's bones lie bleaching in the sun. And in the spirit of Isaiah almost, as a prophet, the speaker admonishes this taking figure, because you are ashamed of God, because you have been paid in cash and you will thrive a while, for yet a very little while, the speaker rises to a conclusion: the tenderness of Christ is fraud. So reading, especially part 2, dealing in your Five Quintets, I was really kind of moved by the kind of providence in a way of reading this and feeling something to do with economic structures and theories and how you engage. You have a whole quintet devoted to thinking about economics. So how do you think about this public discourse and a public discourse that comments on economic systems, justice, the poor, capitalism? How do you think about it? I know we have a couple texts we could read, but how do you just come at it?
Well, I think to place it in a context, the Five Quintets is in fact an attempt to look at modernity over the last 400 years and an attempt to try to understand through the movers and shakers of these 400 years what has happened and what might be the vision for the future. And I wanted to take the whole of society, and it seems to me that by taking the arts, by taking economics, politics, by taking science, and of course theology, stroke philosophy, it covers the breadth largely of what makes up our society and the fabric of our society. So economics for me is a very important part of that. And that plays, of course, into the whole question of the ecology, which is a burning issue for us, literally a burning issue. So I think behind that, economics and politics play very much into that. So we have to take a look at the whole fabric of society. Now, if you're talking about the function of poetry in the public discourse, let me just give you an example actually from science, if I may, because it seems to me a fascinating one. When you think about it, the science which brought us in physics, Newtonian physics, brought us into the whole business of the Enlightenment and measurement and metrics and so forth, which many of us still think in. And for everyday practical use, that is so. But it's almost 100 years, or around 100 years, since we discovered, of course, that the subatomic world, and right down to quarks, right down to the hadrons and so on. The whole of the world is in motion. But that hasn't seeped through yet to the public consciousness. People still think in the Enlightenment mode. They still think in the Newtonian Enlightenment, almost logical positive fashion. Now, it seems to me that poetry can have a huge function here in allowing what we know about the world now scientifically to percolate down into the consciousness, into the social consciousness, into the culture, so people think differently.
That's interesting, because I just was thinking about language there, because language can be fixed in some certain declarative way, but really it knows something else too. It's organic, and it has a life underneath its rigidness. And I think there's something about a scientific analogy there that might bear out in some way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The extraordinary thing about language is that it is so regular
Yeah.
under the surface. In other words, there are rules and there are things changing the whole time, which even a native speaker of the language isn't conscious of, but it's always rearranging itself. The creativity is there and the fixity is there, so to speak, and their intention. I mean, just think of a word, say, like the word status. Do you say status or do you say status?
Right.
We're in a process moving from the Latin status to the diphthong, the standard diphthong of English, status. But nobody who's a native speaker of English thinks about that. It's just happening. You don't talk about ratio, you talk about ratio. It's already happened in these words. So all these things are happening subconsciously almost. And yet the people for whom it's the first language are not aware of it. So you do have this substructure, it's always structuring itself. And even children, when they're learning, have a structure. Even the tiniest children, when they're speaking, they have a grammar of a sort.
Yeah. Well, let's stick with that. And then we can maybe come back for reading to give an example. But I do, because when I think about the art of your poetry, not every poet works in metered poetry anymore, or kind of fixed forms. And you do that. And so we think about, again, what's the relationship between form and content, between sound and sense. The Five Quintets pays it's innovative, but it pays a deep respect to kind of a formalism. So maybe we had a text to read about this dealing section. Maybe you can read that first bit, and then we can kind of think about how form is conveying or content or something along those lines.
Absolutely.
And draw it out further.
Absolutely. Well, let me start with just a brief quotation from the section about the quintet about economics, which I call dealing.
Yeah.
I use a present participle for them all, as you've noticed. Making is the art, and economics is dealing, steering is politics.
Even the five seem to be really musically connected as well.
Well, they are,
yes.
But so I'll just read this piece. Free flow finance gives quick fix gains, but blows up bubbles that must burst. .com will concentrate our cash in risk-free zones, increase the rift between the poor, or puff one currency that soon must crash. A sudden rush, then panic sell. In gaps between we gain and choose when best to bet, trade in and out. A worldwide gain of win or lose.
It hits the here of the word with the rhythm. The rhythm really it means everything to this conveying the truth of this.
Yeah, yes, I mean it's you're talking about in many ways the greater question of form and content,
right?
And that has always fascinated me. Yeah. I mean, there's a big tradition, particularly here in the US. There's a big tradition of free verse, and there's a kind of a myth about that. That anything that has form lacks spontaneity, and that was very much in the American culture. Spontaneity was everything. So I don't quite see it like that. I take the view of the ancient Greeks, which was the perfect marriage between form and content. After all, you could just go out and let us scream, and that would be tremendously spontaneous, but it wouldn't be art. So that you have to face the fact that this is art, in other words, and so it does have form as well as content. Now, the odd thing about it is that sometimes now you have new formalists who come along, and they're so busy wanting to shock you with the rhyme that it actually you react against it, just as people reacted against the sing-song rhyme. I mean, the free verse was a reaction against that. And now the new formalism sometimes comes with these almost outrageous rhymes on purpose to shock you. And that gets tedious after a while too. So it seems to me the perfect mixture is when you get the form and the content coming together unobtrusively. So that I used to occasionally, when I read to a class in a school when I used to visit, I haven't done it for many years, but I would read them a sonnet, and I would say to them, "Did you notice anything about that?" And they'd say, "No, I didn't do anything." And then I would say, "It's actually a sonnet," and I would show it how it was a sonnet. But they were very surprised because the thing had had come together so well that the content had borne them along, and they hadn't noticed it was a sonnet. If you notice too clearly it's a sonnet, then the form has got on top of the content.
I like to think that an uncluttered person, and it's hard to be uncluttered in this, that it just you receive it differently, and maybe it's just almost so subtle that what this is what good art can do. Once with the kids, it was very subtle. They didn't realize it was a structured affair, but that's something in their uncluttered lives that adhere to their understanding. That you know what I mean?
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
I do. And I mean, I've got to say too, I mean, I have written poems with
Sure.
Earlier on, particularly, but I've got more, I think, as time went on, I wanted more structure. See, I don't want to eschew the fun of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember skipping as a child,
Yeah.
and it was quite extraordinary. The rhythms of, wibbledy wobbly, jelly on the plate, jelly on the plate. I just loved it.
Yeah, yeah.
Why should I eschew that? There's a magic to it. When words rhyme, when words have rhythms and so on, it moves you. See, I think in a way of poetry as being somewhere on the spectrum between music and good prose.
Yeah.
Good prose has rhythms, and obviously music has various pitches which you don't. But poetry gets with its rhyme and its sound and its sense gets nearer music than prose. So you're halfway between.
Yeah.
You still have to use your mind in a way that in music it sort of seeps in through the pulses, but it seeps also in a little bit through the pulses with meter and with rhyme and rhythm and so forth.
It's interesting because I teach poetry here at Loyola, undergraduate and graduate, and the undergraduates still say, "Okay, here comes poetry. Do you like poetry?" No, but they love poetry, right? I mean, because it's so close to a kind of a musicality. But let me push a little bit further on this form and content dynamic. The old saying is that discipline will set you free as an artist. So there's something like that. But then your muse, and this has been your muse for a long time, Madam Jazz, right? Now, jazz, to some maybe unenlightened, I suppose, not to be elitist, ear may seem like it has no form to it. Ooh, that would be a mistake.
A huge mistake.
Yeah.
No, you're actually onto there, and I do believe in some ways that discipline is a form of freedom.
Yeah.
And in things that were the most emotional times for me when I wrote the previous book to this one, Crimson Thread, which covered the final years of my late wife's death and my mourning, I reached for the sonnet because it could contain the emotion. Otherwise, you'd float. I mean, the emotion would take you over. So there is a huge thing about that discipline, which actually, and the interplay of discipline helps to form the content, and the content helps to form the discipline. So the form and content both influence one another in quite an extraordinary way. And in jazz, this is, as you say, the great thing is, I remember talking to a saxophonist one time, a friend of mine, and he said, when you take off in a riff, you know exactly where you're going. And if people are good that are with you playing, they know exactly when it's coming back, and they know what's going on. It's this wonderful mix, like life, between the ordinary, because often in jazz you take the ordinary tune, but then, my gosh, what are the wonderful riffs? What are the wonderful ways you can take off on this, which are different, which are new, which are fresh, and yet the underlying is the ordinary. It's like our lives. Our lives are ordinary. We're born and we die, but look what you can do in between.
Right. Yeah, that's beautiful. I was just thinking as you were speaking about, finding some anchorage in form in the sonnet with your late wife's Parkinson's disease and her subsequent death, and may God rest her. I was talking to a Jesuit once, Jack Isaac, God rest him. He was speaking about the church, and he said, "Can you imagine not having the church as you stood before God?" And I thought, yeah, I can imagine that. But I think what he was trying to say was the sacramentality and liturgy was a way for humans. It wasn't God; it was us. It helped us to face God. Some kind of structure that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I have occasionally attended humanist funerals, and you long for liturgy. You absolutely long for liturgy, and I think everybody who even isn't a believer would long for liturgy, because we need these forms to deal with life. So you're right. I think it's the humans that need it more than any God needs it.
Yeah. Let's think a bit more along these theological lines and content and ideas, and we turn a bit to theology and philosophy. As an Irishman, you've seen collisions of religion turn to violence in your life. Not only culturally and aesthetically, but politically. Do you think that Protestant and Catholic theological imaginations shape or have shaped late modern political life differently? Can these, yeah.
It's a very difficult one. It's a very tricky one. I've often thought about this. I think whatever about shaping the imagination, I think it does have an effect on society, because, and this is very broad terms, but as I see what happened in the Reformation was that you had in Catholicism an overemphasis of the sacramental and somewhat a neglect of the word. I mean, that was even true in my upbringing. I mean, you were parsing out parts of the Bible in Mass and in other liturgies, but you weren't encouraged to read it. I mean, I know post-Vatican II that came in.
Catholics don't know the Bible famously.
No, of course, not at all. I mean, as a growing up, I wouldn't have known there was 150 Psalms. How would I have known? I never read them that way when I was a boy. There are Psalms I love. I mean, I think they're extraordinary, but you didn't. So what I'm coming around to is that I see, it's heartbreaking to think that the correction that took place towards the word, if that had only happened within Catholicism, look what we'd have been spared.
Right.
Look at the 30 Years' War, which is still being echoed in Northern Ireland, as we speak. What we'd have been spared if that shift towards the word, back towards to get an ecology between the word and sacrament had happened within Catholicism, but it didn't. And history is history. But it seems to me that if you look at societies where Catholicism fades and secularization takes over, I think the effect is different, say, than when you have Lutheranism. And I'm thinking, I lived in Norway. I was at university in Oslo. And though most of my friends wouldn't have at the time believed in anything particular, but they'd have had a Lutheran background, they'd have had an emphasis on the word. It seems to me that left them with a civic consciousness, with a feeling of duty towards other people and so on, because the word was important to them. Whereas where you have Catholicism fading, or where it goes, it leaves more chaos, it seems to me, because it doesn't leave that legacy in the same way of civil consciousness and civil conscious. Now, I may be wrong, but I've always felt that because when the sacrament breaks down, what have you?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think there's a lot there. I think even you can find an analogy in American history that was largely founded by Protestants. There was a civic responsibility that was way more kind of constituent and baked in.
Yes.
That is almost diminishing now. But then Catholic social teaching is also very popular in this country, and that really does, that really is a more articulate, I think, theory of the common good, our lives together, that does kind of reduce to a civic responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely, and it should.
Yes.
But in my experience, it's when sacrament breaks down.
Yeah, I think
there's more. It's more chaotic somehow or other.
And I see that. That's something for me to think about further. Now, let's bring someone like Charles Taylor into the conversation, who I know you read and figures into your work. Now, let's pick up on secularism. What is gained, what is lost in this current moment? What has replaced these structures of religion, if anything at all?
Well, I mean, if I can return to the five quintets,
sure.
I mean, in each of them I have tried to come towards a vision of what the future might be. We spoke earlier of economics, and my vision is one where all human resources are brought together in the hope of, with generosity and justice, in the hope of allowing people to achieve their potentiality. And I stress potentiality because that's the Amartya Sen view of it,
yes.
Not simply counting out the economics or the metrics of a given country. Yeah. And the same in the politics. I take this vision of wanting to start from where we are, pragmatically from where we are, never a tabula rasa, and really moving pragmatically, trying to help society flourish, but being prepared in humility, patience, and fortitude to realize you're only going to make the world a little less imperfect than it is.
Yes.
There are no perfections, and yet we strive. We must strive.
Yeah.
And then back to your question about the theology and the philosophy. This one fascinates me because I I have read Charles Taylor. In fact, it was very influential when I began on the five quintets because he covers this 400 years. And his basic premises is that you start in a society where God is taken for granted, and you finish in a society, the Atlantic culture, as he calls it, though I think you could throw in Japan as well, but where in academe, at least, the default position is agnostic, if not atheist. But I wanted to do this with the movers and shakers, with people, with personalities, and so forth. And so, where is this all leading? I think it's leading to the vision in this one is leading to the idea that look, we are still human beings, and human beings are seekers of meaning. There's no doubt about that. We seek meaning, but we're now in a multicultural society, multiracial society. We can never again isolate ourselves. So we have to learn to live with the quality of difference and tolerance, which doesn't mean not the deepening of one's own faith, but allowing conversation and collaboration with people of different views and different faiths. But I think that has to be faced.
Yeah.
And it's no bad thing, because I often think of Solzhenitsyn's Nobel Prize speech when he talked about having a jewel with the sun sparkling it out in different directions.
Yes.
We haven't a monopoly on truth. It sparkles out in different directions. Our direction is the one, in which I have been reared, in which I see it through. But I must always allow for the fact that I don't have that monopoly. Others have the sparkle, and we don't own God.
Yeah, we don't. I think that's beautiful, and I think I see that in five quintets. It opens and opens, even though it accounts for history. And you mentioned a couple of things there. It's pragmatic, but it accounts for history. It looks at Greek virtues you just mentioned that are as useful today, and the society is different, but those virtues are
Absolutely.
But that there's the Solzhenitsyn is a perfect example. It's almost the Jesuits always say around here. They are moving out into culture to be with people, to accompany people, and they're always asking, "What is God doing over there?" Right? We don't harness and shackle God. We'll never get there. And God, and if we open up, that's who God is. So
absolutely. And I mean, if to return again to in the science, which I didn't mention, that seems to me. I mentioned earlier, of course, that we now know that that everything is dancing, and that there is no view from nowhere. And that's, I think, the important thing for us is that. Once Heisenberg came, and once we realized that we can't observe without affecting our environment, we are part of it all. Right. And so it seems to me the vision must be to keep on exploring, always trying to find more, but in the knowledge that we are part of it, in the knowledge that we can never have an overview, we can never be outside of it.
Yes.
And so we must be part of the wonder, as we discover, in humility, to know that there'll probably be mysteries that will always elude us.
Right. Now, I could Taylor's observation that faith has become one discourse or one life among many. He's right. That's how people view it. But I don't think that replaces the reality of what you're. I mean, it doesn't.
No. I admired that book very much, but I don't want to be too hard, but I feel that the vision at the end peters out a little bit. But I'm a huge admirer of the book and of Sources of Self, which was another great inspiring book.
Yes. Well, if you wouldn't mind, we can maybe make a transition, because we're talking about choreography and dancing, and it figures in your work prominently. So if you wouldn't mind reading the section we spoke about before, and then I'll follow up with a question.
The real balance then is raised, which means consumption grows, and such a rising tide will hoist anew the whole economy to even greater heights. And so we see there never is a need to intervene. Instead, we let the system stabilize itself and sanction market's own machine. All right in theory, at least. But only time would tell how long stagnation needs to last before the prices fall enough to prime consumers' trust, as some will wait until they tumble even more. Or what about each deepening debt and those whose business may go bust? So much more harrowing and hurt before regimes can readjust. Your schemes to mend communities reign in the individual. Your lavish Browning breadth of view remains the legacy you leave. There is no good of life but love. As in our globe you glimpse anew one interjoined ecology that's loose and yet it's so precise, a fitting choreography, prefigured dance of paradise.
Yeah.
That's, of course, about Marshall, who was highly influenced by Browning, the poet, who also figures in the making, in the section on the arts, in the quintet about the arts, because Browning was a very public poet.
Right, that's a great point to make. I think what moved me in these last lines, because you are meditating on economics, business, abuses, successes, but that we are reminded here that these systems, they mean nothing unless they are focused on humans, and what is the virtue of humans, or what's the highest place that we can reach? It's love.
Of course, that is what must steer, in my vision, of where economics has to go. It steers the whole thought of, as I said, harnessing all our resources so that people can achieve their potential. But we must do it with justice and generosity, not just justice, but the combination of justice and generosity, which, of course, points towards love.
Yes. Thank you. And then, again, the choreography that figures so prominently in your work, it just makes me think, as we move toward kind of the final part of the interview, is, the last, and, this took you 10 years to write. It's a major part of your life. Yes. And I've been reading it off and on for a couple of months. And I may be halfway through, but then I kind of jumped forward, which I didn't want to do. But when I wanted to read the Meaning quintet. And when I came across figures in that quintet, I was so very moved, and I thought of all the theology that I studied. So you mentioned everybody in Canto 4, for example, you have Hegel, Kierkegaard, Barth, Levinas, Arendt, and then a person I worked on is Hans Urs von Balthasar.
Oh yes,
I just jumped for joy.
Yes, the Saturday people.
The Saturday people, Holy Saturday. But also the who he worked on. He was a great debt to Maximus Confessor, whose theology of perichoresis is very, very important. I think there's just the dance, the divine dance.
Yes, it's a wonderful concept, and it runs, as you said, right through the 5 quintets. Yeah. Because when you think about it, I'll read the epigraph when we come to the end of our interview, because it prefigures Adam Braith's the message, if you like, or the vision, I prefer to call it, or the angle of vision in each of the quintets. Von Balthasar, or Balthasar, as I should say, he was an extraordinary figure for me too, and also his relationship with this, was it Speyer, was the name of the lady?
Adrienne von Speyer.
Absolutely extraordinary, that inspiration. And I mean, there was nothing untoward about it. Barth, on the other hand, lived with his mistress and his secretary and his wife in the one house. So, I mean, it begs all sorts of questions. Been one of the greatest theologians of the last century, But it is very interesting that but women were the muses in some ways for both of these extraordinary and almost parallel figures, in a way. Balthasar being the Catholic one.
They were close friends, Barth and Balthasar.
That's right.
Balthasar respected Barth quite deeply.
Yes.
I think he called him a better theologian half the time.
Yeah, and wasn't Barth asked to the Vatican as well? He was the first to be asked to the Vatican. No, they're an extraordinary pairing.
Yeah, it's quite a time too. There's robust public theology in those days, and I don't know if we have that today so much, and for a lot of reasons. But do you think of yourself as a Catholic poet? How does that? Yeah.
The answer, I think, to that is no. Yeah. I see myself as a poet who is a Catholic. Yeah. That is to say, I'm a Catholic. I do my best. I am somewhat a la carte, but that's my tradition. That's, as the Buddha said, grow where you're planted, and so I do my best to grow where I'm planted. For all my differences about certain things and so forth, I do my best to do it, and that obviously informs my work.
Yeah, I think of Flannery O'Connor there, who said very similar things about being a writer. You wouldn't, how would, it's almost a way you understand being, right? And a way you understand art. The art is the thing, the vision's the thing. And the vision is true to any type of theology. It's almost a silent reality, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, Patrick Kavanagh, who for me was the greatest poet, at his best, was the greatest Irish poet of the 20th century. He said any poet was a theologian.
Yes.
And after all, both, to my view, as I see poetry, both are seekers of meaning and beauty.
Yeah, I love that. I always love that about Patrick Kavanagh quite a lot. I think even scientists are theologians. A lot of them don't want to say they are, but I think that in many ways that they're doing that
absolutely.
Kind of work.
It sometimes frightens me the number, not all by any means, but the number of scientists who don't see the poetry and don't see the theology in what they're doing. Their vision is too narrow.
Yeah.
I hope, from what I've done in the 5 quintets in this section called Finding about science, I have interspersed between all the wonders as they are being discovered. I've interspersed quotations from the Psalms and from the Quran.
It's excellent. I need to read that section, and I'm thinking right now, just practically and pedagogically, to get that section into some. We have a textbook here out of Loyola called Healing Earth that brings spirituality to environmental science. Maybe it's an ebook. I wonder if there's a way to put in that chapter, because it's bereft of poetics. That book is. Yeah, and we need poetry.
Yeah, no, it's for me that was the extraordinary thing. I've never seen the contradiction. When the Psalms or even the Quran, which as I said I quote as well, express this extraordinary wonder at creation. Yes. Each time you've gone into the subatomic world, or when you've gone up into the black holes, up into the universe, this galaxy in which we're out on the edge in a tiny little spot. I mean, the wonder of that, I see no contradiction.
Yeah, agreed. I don't either. I wonder, not dancing around this, but we need to make a connection to Dante. You think about theology and poetry, but even science and politics, that view Dante had, maybe not as developed in science, but that kind of wide-ranging interdisciplinary view Dante modeled for us. How do you think about your connection with the 5 quintets to?
Well, Dante is my model because at the end of the Middle Ages, he summed up the Middle Ages and somehow prepared, on the cusp of modernity, prepared us for modernity. My hope, and this may be hubris, but my hope is when modernity seems to be passing, whatever we call it, to post-modernity, late modernity, chase at modernity, but there's been a paradigm shift, to use the scientific Thomas Cluan term, I think it is. The certainties have fallen that we were used to. So I wanted to try and sum that up, but also point towards where we might be headed, what values we need to take with us and to retrieve and to nurture.
Yeah. We're doing a 50-year look back at the year 1968 and comparing it to 2018. And I think most people will say that we are living in a convulsive time that's might be the biggest sea change since Gutenberg's printing press in 1438.
Yes, which marks the beginning of modernity.
Exactly.
Yes.
So you were a student in '68, right?
I was.
And how do you think about those 50 years? Are things kind of exponentially spinning here? We have the digital revolution. We have, Taylor and exclusive humanism in 1968. All these shifts, Thomas Kuhn's models of paradigm shifts, all these things are happening in this 50 years. So you wake up one morning and you feel like there's no ground there anymore.
Yeah. So I did do a book called Globe, which focused on that theme. Would we be remembered for anything? Or do we leave any footprints at all? The whole thing is so mobile in many ways. So it's been an extraordinary 50 years to live through. And I think it's living through those 50 years. The break we made in the 60s, and I was part of that break. We were the 68 generation when the student revolutions. We were going to mend the world. I had the answer to everything when I was in 1968. I knew everything. And suddenly, the next generation came along and saw, in some ways, the flower power people as foolish. They weren't political. They hadn't the fortitude and patience of politics. Right. They just wanted everything immediately. And a disillusion came in, a whole individualistic, a gopher generation came. And I lived through all of that, and both the elation and the disillusionment afterwards about it, which I think forced me ultimately to think as to where we were in the bigger picture of things as we move towards, I think, the end of what will be seen as modernity.
Yeah, I think you're correct. What would you cite as disillusioning? What did you wake up to?
I woke up to the disillusionment that economics had so much to do with it, because we in the 60s on a bubble, there was a great, particularly in Ireland, where the economy took off, we industrialized and so forth, and all students talked about politics. We talked about philosophy. I mean, we rebelled against our backgrounds in many ways, both class and religion, and then existentialism was all the rage. Beckett's Waiting for Godot, all of that was in the air. And suddenly then a generation came after us who only thought about where were they going to get a job and make a career, because the economy had changed. And it was very shocking to see that in many ways. So that influences me too in making sure there's a quintet about the economy, because it is a huge part of the fabric of society, alongside the arts and sciences and the theology, philosophy, and politics.
Right. That's an essential point to make. That really does make a lot of sense. Thank you for that. We'll just a little lightning round of not too personal questions, and then we can conclude with a little reading from the 5 quintets, if you wouldn't mind.
I'd be delighted to
Okay.
do that.
Dublin versus New York City.
Well, I moved to New York City at 67, I went first there in 71. I wouldn't have found my way around a corner. I got in taxis to wherever I was reading and so forth. It was an extraordinary move, one I had never expected. If you told me a year earlier I'd be living in Manhattan, I wouldn't have believed you. But love does that to you.
Yeah.
And I fell in love with a New Yorker. She's a top surgeon in New York, and I could work in New York. Her career was in New York, so I came.
Yeah.
It's been very exciting. It's been a wonderful 4.5 years. And, New York for me is, if there was more generosity, if that 1% didn't hold 99%, I'm talking Paul Krugman, of course, The Economist. Sure. If there was more generosity and justice and gentleness, New York is a prevision of heaven. Look at all the races, all the religions, every size, shape of human being, all walking the streets, talking all these languages, professing all these different faiths, all these different cultures. It is a prevision of heaven. There's heaven, as I said, but it needs more generosity and more gentleness.
Yeah. Thank you.
And justice.
And justice, yes. Agreed. Okay, a book you're reading that our viewers may want to take a look at? Anything striking your fancy these days?
I'm just trying to think straight off what the most exciting thing reading is. I suppose what I'm reading most is my closest friend for 50-something years since I was in Trinity is David Ford.
Oh, the theologian.
The theologian, exactly. And that's why I've been reading theology all my life, because I was his first reader and he was my first reader. And he is at the moment doing a commentary on John's Gospel. And so I'm reading it as it comes out. And I think that's probably one of the most fascinating things I'm reading at the moment.
That's great. He's Lewis to your Tolkien or something like that? C.S. Lewis?
Yes. I wasn't aware of that relationship.
They were very, very close friends for lots of years. Excellent. And then, these are basic, but viewer, you should read this poet. Which poet would you say?
Oh, Patrick Kavanagh.
Yeah.
I would say immediately. He is, in my mind, at his best, the greatest poet of the 20th century in Ireland, and not well enough known abroad.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you for that. Okay. Well,
and Denise Levertov would be another name I mentioned. You mentioned her before. Though there's some very beautiful poetry, very, very beautiful poetry there. And if you want to go back, this is actually biographical. But when David and I became close friends first, we swapped poets. He gave me Herbert, and I gave him Kavanagh. And we both made a list of our favorite poems in the books, and still have those lists. So I would say Kavanagh, Herbert.
Yeah, Herbert.
And I would also say Denise Levertov.
I work on Denise Levertov. In fact, we're going to a class afterwards, and Levertov is the subject today. So one of our students is giving a seminar on Denise Levertov. Dear viewer, if you've not read Levertov, make your way with haste to her work. Okay, well, we've come to it now. We really want to congratulate you on this book, The 5 Quintets. This is a masterwork. It took over 9 years, close to 10 years, to what? How do you view it? It would be fatuous to say it's male birth. Men say, "Oh, I gave birth." It's not like that. But how do you view giving the book to the world? How does that feel for you?
Well, it's you have no choice. I remember once in Japan when I was asked a question similar to that from the audience, and somebody said, "Why did you choose poetry?" And I said, "No, poetry chose me." And I got that wonderful sound that comes from Japanese audiences when you say something that surprises them. It goes, they all go, "Ooh."
Well, then I will as well. Ooh. Thank you, Micheal.
The first verse is an invocation, which is very traditional. I mean, this is a Dantean work, if you like. Milton, the same. These works tend to start with invocations. The second to sixth prefigure the vision of each of the quintets. The first one being obviously the arts, meaning. Second one being dealing, which is economics. The third one, steering, which is the metaphor for politics. And the fourth one, finding, for science. And the fifth one, meaning, for theology / philosophy. So the vision is in 2 to 6, and then I finish off with 2 further verses. Be with me, Madam Jazz, I urge you now. Riff in me so I can conjure how you breathe in us more than we dare allow. In words and hues and tones, please, Madam Blow, play in me the grace I need to know how in your complex glory we let go. Show me how an open hand is worry-free. Spark again your love's economy, your generous first words spoken, let there be. Enhance our trust in hard-earned betterment. Humbler world we may in turn augment in long adagios of increment. While marveling at your choreography, stars and quarks beyond our mastery, we still explore to praise your mystery. Although each sacred book's a lip-read score, improvising there is always more. You jazz and what's our own and our rapport. Each solo an ensemble of a piece, grooves and tempos shifting without cease. We flourish in a syncopated peace. In all our imperfections we advance, trusting in creation's free-willed chance. Sweet Madam Jazz, in you we are the dance.